Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Cerro Azul Enano Wash Process Colombia from Equator Coffee. And there's the bag right there. Alright, we're going to have a ridiculous amount of fun with this review as there's so much behind this coffee roaster. Let me get some very basic information out of the way. Looks like they're based out of San Rafael, California, and for the longest time I thought they were based out of San Francisco, but yeah, looking at all their information, they list either San Rafael or Marin. So yeah, they're based out of an area just north of San Francisco. They've been around since 1995, so massive props to a business like Equator for keeping yourselves relevant in a ever-changing coffee world for as long as they have. That's always something hugely respectable for a business that's been around that long. All right, the story behind this coffee, and it's actually a great one. So we have a really good buddy, Jack, that we talk coffee with basically every single day. He insists his favorite coffee roaster pretty much in the entire world is Equator. And we made him a deal and said, pick out any coffee from Equator any time of the year, we'll purchase it, review it, and give you our honest thoughts and assessment of it. This all comes from a pretty extensive background with Equator, as we used to take so many trips to San Francisco. San Francisco has an amazing food scene and a pretty decent coffee scene. Been to their coffee shop plenty of times, as well as did a cupping with one of the, I want to say co-founders or co-owners at the La Marzocco in Seattle, I want to say a couple years ago. So we've had a lot of history with their coffee, and that being said, they're not one of our favorite coffee roasters in San Francisco, as there's some other places that we enjoy a lot more. Our last experience with Equator was we ordered a higher end coffee. I want to say it was a Yemen, some sort of Middle Eastern coffee, pretty expensive, as well as I want to say it was either a Sadama or a Yirgacheffe, and that coffee was roasted pretty dark, so we didn't have the best last impression of the coffee we had as we didn't necessarily enjoy both of the last cups of coffee we had from them. Jack insisted they have improved as a coffee roaster, and we want to give them a very fair shake and assessment. So this coffee, which is perfectly in line with our flavor profile, it's an Enano, which is described as a dwarf geisha, which is supposed to be a mutation of the geisha variety. Supposed to act like a geisha. Interesting sounding coffee. Sped run through that information. Hopefully that's all out of the way. Hopefully didn't forget anything, but yeah. Let's start discussing this coffee, starting with the recipe. They have a pretty ambiguous recipe on their website that says, on their bag actually, that says 2 tablespoons ground coffee, 6 ounces of water brewed at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Tried it, didn't necessarily love it at that recipe. Like our standard recipe, 16.67 to 1 at 204 degrees Fahrenheit. Brewed to the Chemex, and roast profile for this one's interesting. So it's definitely on the lighter end of their scale. We'll just be safe and call it a light medium American for the roast profile, but it was an interesting thing. All right, this right here is day 18 of the coffee. Let's start discussing this coffee. All right, day 6 was our first impression. And what we were expecting was a super yellow fruit forward cup of coffee, and it wasn't quite as lively as we had expected. There were some slight florals, but that was the most dominant characteristic in this coffee, and it was probably too early to be drinking the coffee, so whatever. Day 7 went back much improved. Probably the best day of this coffee actually was day 7, which was pretty early in this coffee. Felt like freshly cut yellow fruit, very distinct, in line with those basically fresh fruit flavors. Nothing overly notable on the florals, but the fruits were pretty clean, pretty nice, very enjoyable on day 7. Day 9 went back, and coffee's still a bit lively in terms of those yellow fruits, but not quite as prominent as we had experienced on day 7. Day 11 went back, and while the coffee had been somewhat consistent up to that point, we started noticing some inconsistencies in this coffee. It was yellow fruit dominant, but it wasn't quite still as lively as it had been on previous days, and coffee was ever changing in a sense. Day 12, going a little deeper in depth into this coffee. The coffee was definitely our favorite on day 7. And at this point, what we would describe as a slight bit of some extras in this coffee, some slight smoky chocolate, and peach had a more like artificial sugary component to it. And this is a perfect opportunity to say not all peaches are created equal. So the highlight of this year has been the Luna Bermudez peach, which tasted very much in line with Albanese peach gummy rings, and washed Guji Ethiopia's taste like a very distinct kind of cleaner peach. This one feels like a slightly more artificial sugary peach that is not quite the same as those other peaches. So not all peaches are created equal. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Day 13 went back, coffee still a little inconsistent, not quite as lively on this day either, and it was at this point that this artificial sugary component to the peach was a little bit more prominent than what we had experienced as this really kind of nice fresh fruit flavor early on in the coffee. Day 15, we tried the temperature and recipe that they had listed, and yeah, no need to note too much or comment too much on that day, as instantly we went back to higher temperatures, as it was definitely not as lively or as great as it had been on other days when we had a higher temperature. And day 16, continue to emphasize that this coffee can be a little inconsistent. Sugary component is always going to be there. This was another nice day for the yellow fruit, but a bit of sugar that was kind of dominating the way that the coffee had tasted. And this is again changing. Day 18, coffee a little bit more in line with the fresh fruits. Definitely can still get a slight bit of this artificial flavor. The mango I felt like was honestly better than the peach in this coffee, and they list honeysuckle on here. We've described honeysuckle in other videos as tasting like a butter popcorn jelly bean, and truth be told, never got a great bit of that flavor, but there were some noticeable florals in this cup of coffee regardless. Alright, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And things that will jump out, stone fruit, it definitely was there. Mango, probably slightly more prominent than the peach. Both of them definitely still there. Pretty clean cup of coffee, pretty lasting finish, pretty sweet. Florals still pretty high, acidity pretty low. A couple of other things as mentioned. Body medium, so that was the one part that was kind of interesting, because this coffee did have a higher, heavier than expected body, especially for something that's supposed to be acting like a geisha. So interesting. Slight bit of citrus fruit as well, slight bit of chocolate. Not too much else in this cup of coffee, but yeah, tasting wheel for the most part looks pretty good. Improved day on this one as well. Alright, our final thoughts and impressions of this coffee, as well as if it changed any thoughts and impressions of Equator. So, tricky. Knew we were going to have a hard time at this point, but so we did enjoy this coffee on certain times at certain days, but kind of the inconsistency of the way that this coffee was made it a little bit more tricky in terms of both a review and kind of giving an overall feeling and assessment for this coffee. It's probably the best coffee I think I've ever had from Equator, and it does show that, Jack, you're probably right, Equator is probably getting better. They're not one of my favorite coffee roasters in San Francisco or the Bay Area still, but it seems like they might be creeping up and getting better and improving and getting closer towards some of the coffee roasters I do enjoy a little more. So I will give props to Equator and say, even if this is my flavor profile, they did a better job than I've experienced in the past with their coffee. So my overall impression of Equator has improved slightly, but not by a huge margin. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This coffee is a little interesting. So it acts a little bit more medium, even though I know that this is what they would call a little lighter. It's definitely not medium to the extent that something like a Ruby might be, or yeah, some of the more medium coffees like a Mod Cup, but that being said, it just acts that way in terms of some of the extras you're getting from this, the body that you're getting from this. So it's an interesting cup of coffee, and interesting is always a positive comment, I would say. Yeah. Regardless, I think I'm going to leave it at that though. I actually did really enjoy reviewing this. It was a fun review, and I really want to thank Jack. Yeah, Equator needed to be reviewed at some point, so I appreciate it. I'm going to leave it at that. If you've by chance tried this same coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Cerro Azul Enano Wash Process Colombia from Equator Coffee. Thank you for watching.